Okay, well, I think we'll start. We'll make a start now. I think we've got most of the people who are joining today who have now logged on. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for signing on to join us today. This is the fourth in our series of HESES webinars on HESES20. And today we're going to be looking at the submission and verification of the HESES20 workbook. And my name is Roger Lear, as you can see. So for those who have been keeping up with the webinars that we've had so far, the next few slides will be familiar, but we'll go through them. Anyway, a certain amount of housekeeping to be done. So as you can see, that's my name there as main presenter, and my colleague Will Scott is standing by to step in should anything happen in terms of my link. And then, as before, we'll be pausing on a few occasions as we go through for responses to questions and that you may be submitting to us, and my colleague Claudia Stilliard will be doing that for us. So to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat. We keep the chat for you to speak with the members of our events team who are supporting the webinar. And I should also say that by all means, if you want to ask questions anonymously, that's fine, you can do that. If, as is occasionally the case, we need to answer a bit more fully, or it's a bit more technical and it's not easily addressed in the context of a webinar, it's handy if we've got your names, so it's helpful from that point of view, but you can always write an email to us at HESES@officefordstudents.org.uk in any case. Closed captions are available. You click on the icon to get those, and as with the other sessions that we've had so far, this session is being recorded, and it will become available within, I think we're taking about 48 hours to get them turned around at the moment. So look at the events page of our website for further details on that. And as we have said before, this is the first time that we've done these by way of webinar rather than actually going out on the road like we've done the last few years. And so any feedback that you can give us is something that we'd like to have. And as we've said before, to those participants who have agreed to receive one, we'll be sending an evaluation form to you after the workbook sessions have taken place, so we can get some feedback. But as I say, we're happy to take feedback in any form if you'd like to give it to us. So just to put that flag in the ground. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. And first of all, we're going to look at the submission of your HESES20 workbook. So the Higher Education Students Early Statistics Survey, to give it its full title, HESES20. As we've said in the past, these webinars are beginners sessions really for people who are completing HESES for perhaps the first time or just need a back to basic summary. So we'll cover the subject of how to upload your completed workbook to the OFS portal. And then we're going to move on and look at how we carry out data verification. And we'll look at one or two ideas about how that might be streamlined so that we get through it all a lot quicker. And then the final part of the session is going to deal with the submission, the sign-off, getting your sign-off for the submission. And in many ways, that's perhaps the most important part of the whole process, because that's what we're leading up to. So just to put all of this in the context of where we are in the great scheme of things, as I said earlier, this is the fourth of our series of webinars. And as you can see, it's the last in terms of content, really. Next week, we start with our hands-on workbook sessions where we have exercises and breakout groups. And as you can see, the first two dates on the 12th and the 14th of October, these are already full, but we have added a couple of extra dates in the following week, the 20th and the 22nd of October. And if you want to find out more about those and sign up for those, you can go to officefordstudents.org.uk/events, where you'll be able to find further details of those. So I'll leave you to explore that. And then also supporting materials. As I mentioned, recordings are available within about 48 hours. and we will put the slides and anything else appropriate for each session alongside it. And there's some documentation which is more generally applicable. Claudia mentioned in the beginning session last week, the guide to funding, which is a good background to where HESES sits in the funding cycle. And then we've got the main HESES guidance and how to complete the HESES20 workbook publication and its appendices. Now, for all of these sessions, we've had people asking about when the workbook is going to be available and when the documentation is going to be available. In terms of actually releasing the workbooks for themselves, the real workbooks, we'll see that in a moment in the timetable. A model workbook will be published alongside all of the documentation, and I am told that the very latest news on the release of the documentation is that it is expected this week. I know that we've been saying that for a week or two, but progress is being made and it should be on our website very shortly. So look for www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES for that. And at about the same time that that goes live, you will also see on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/officeforstudents, you will see a number of videos, and I'll be referring to all of these resources as we go through the session today. And if they aren't actually available now, they will be very soon. So that's going to make your life a lot easier when you can refer to those, I know. But thank you for bearing with us whilst we're getting all of the appropriate sign-offs on these. So I think that is most of the housekeeping for the time being. So let's move on to the first part of the presentation today, which deals with how to submit your HESES workbook. And I mentioned the timeline there, so it's good to set the scene here in terms of where we are when we come to this point in the process. As I've just mentioned, the workbooks themselves for each provider will be available to download from the portal in late October, and you can also see here the census dates, which were talked a lot about in the last session. As you'll recall, it depends on the type of provider in question. Further education at sixth form colleges and academies, the census date is the 1st of November. For everybody else, it's the 1st of December. But today our focus is going to be on how to submit the workbook through the portal and what happens after that. And with that in mind, you need to know the deadline dates for workbook submission. And I put these in bold on this slide so you can see more easily. So for further education at sixth form colleges and academies, it's noon on the 12th of November. For everybody else, it's noon on the 10th of December. Now, we don't allow submissions, extensions to the submission deadline. So please make sure that you get your submission in before then. And even if you feel it's not completely as you'd like it, before the sign off, changes can be made as part of the data verification process, and India will address that issue as we look at the data verification process. But as you can see that after the submission deadline passes, that's not the end of things. We go into the data verification process where we ask you questions about your data based on various criteria, and we'll explore that. But 2nd of February next year is the point at which we look to have everything signed off by each provider's accountable officer. So let's start to think about this in a bit more detail now. And submitting the workbook, we use the OFS portal. And you may say, well, why use the portal? Because it's a safe, secure, controlled method of sending and receiving workbooks. We'd ask, please, that you do not send HESES workbooks by email. Aside from the fact that email is not a wholly reliable medium, especially with attachments, its security is perhaps not the best. And although it's unlikely for some providers who have to fill in what we call the courses table, it's conceivable in certain circumstances that there's a likelihood, the chance of individual students being identified from that data is greater. So for this and for other reasons, it's generally better for everybody to use the most secure method of transfer, which is to use a portal. If you find during the course of this that you do need to send us additional sensitive information, then please get in touch with us first rather than just send it through email or something like that. And we'll arrange for a secure method of transferring that information to be utilised. Now, in this session, I'm only going to touch on the use of the portal because as part of the resources which are about to become available at officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, there are detailed written and indeed now video resources. We've got a session, a live session on the portal recorded as part of one of our videos this year. And I hope that that will help everybody who is struggling perhaps for the first time coming to grips with the portal, but we'll touch on some of the important points as we go through here today. So that's mentioned there on the YouTube playlist, and also in the appendix number 1 to the document I referred to earlier, completing the HESES20 workbook document. There is a document which is called downloading and submitting HESES20. So that's where you'll find chapter and verse, but we'll just spend a few moments going through what some of the important points here. So the portal can be found at the address that you can see in the heading there. And again, there are some people who rely on the audio for these presentations, so I'm going to spell this out: https://extranet.officeforstudents.org.uk/data. And the HTTPS prefix here that you can see is important to ensure that you reach this over a secure link. When you enter that in the address bar of your browser, you should then see something like this. And of course, there's a sign-on, as you can see. Now, at each provider, access to the portal is administered locally by user administrators. And you can see that there's a link here at the top of this page for people in that capacity, which is helpful. User administrators will need to set their colleagues up with portal user IDs, and for those that are dealing with HESES. And they do this by providing access to what we call an area of the portal. And it's from here that you'll download and then upload and submit your workbook. So for this year, there are a couple of areas, well, only one which you'll actually need to know about, but again, it depends on which type of provider you are. So here, the one that you can see here, HESES20_FEC, is what is going to be used for further education at sixth form colleges and academies. If you're at the other types of providers, then it's going to be HESES20_OTH. Now, a lot of attendees to this webinar are probably going to be user administrators themselves and can set this up for themselves. But if you're not, and if you don't know who your user administrators are at your provider, then this is what you need to do to find out. If you already have a portal ID, please see these resources which I've already mentioned, the video and the appendix, which will be published shortly, because they have full details about how you can identify your local user administrator. Only if you don't already have a portal ID and you don't know who the user administrator is, the best thing to do is to write an email to portal@officeforstudents.org.uk, and the team there will help you get in touch with whoever it is locally that administers the portal for you. Again, full details of all of this are in the publications that we've talked about there. So let's move on and just talk about HESES submissions and when they can be done. Before the census date, uploads are permitted, but submissions are not treated as valid. And this really just stems from the fact that because the workbook has column 1, as you know, in various places, which asks for a snapshot at the census date. Anything submitted before the census date is clearly not representative of that. So you can use it, if you like, as a practice period, if you're not familiar with uploading, but nothing there will be taken as valid. However, after the census date, again, you can do as many submissions as you like before the submission deadline. However, at that point, or after the submission deadline has passed, data verification begins, and we use the most recently submitted workbook as the definitive one. Now, there's one important thing to note here in terms of workbooks. Sometimes people, they are locked and protected in different ways. And occasionally what we'll find is that people will try to unlock them or unprotect them. And we ask that you please don't do that. And that's primarily because that can throw the processing behind the scenes in the portal out of whack and cause delays. So we ask you not to do that, and we will not accept unlocked workbooks as valid submissions. Okay, let's look now at what happens when you do submit the workbook. I won't spend a long time on this again because the other resources that I've described will show you and write up, and it's written down in some considerable detail about how it works, but it's useful to just go through the main points here. So to start the upload, you're going to log on to the portal and navigate to the correct area, as we described earlier. And when you've got your workbook ready, you can click on the upload button. You'll be prompted to locate your file and set the process in motion. And it's worth saying that actually it's a single thread process, so it might take a little while. You'll be placed in a queue, but the good news is that you don't have to stay logged on while you're being queued. You can log off and return later if you wish. And it's also probably worth saying that on deadline day, things get busy, so try if you can to avoid the last minute rush that is often seen on those occasions. So when the upload is complete, there'll be a couple of fields to check on the screen called outcome and comments, and have a look at those for error fields or anything like that being reported. And again, the appendix to the completing the HESES20 workbook, Appendix 1, has full details of what you will need to do if there are errors reported. If the submission was successful, you will find that you can download what we call the results package. You do that by clicking on the result link, and we'll look at that in a moment. Now, there's one thing to bear in mind here, which is that only the person that did the upload can download the results package. So it's as well to get that stored in a safe place that's available to everybody that needs it, needs access to it. And that way, that if there's any unexpected absence of that person, then there's still people who can access the right stuff. Again, you'll see this link over and over, and this reference to the appendix and to the videos. When they are available, please do look at them, and I hope particularly that the live demo that we've done this year will help people who are having any sort of questions about how to use the portal. Okay, we've talked about the results package, so let's look at this in a bit more detail. Now, as I said, it's actually a zip file, and in it you will find a version of your workbook with your submitted data in it. And you'll find that some information has been added on the information sheet, and we'll look at that in a moment, but basically we add a submission date and a submission number. It's also occasionally necessary as we go through HESES to update the workbook if there are any fixes which are needed. So occasionally we find that a provider might have used an older version of the workbook for their submission, which has been superseded. And so what you'll find then is that in the workbook, in your results package, you will find that it's been upgraded to the latest and greatest. You'll see a version number in the slide I'm going to show you in a moment, which indicates which version you're running on. So this workbook, which holds the identification information, as I say, this is the one that we will use for data verification. And you should download this, keep it in a safe place. And if you need to resubmit, it's probably a good idea to use a copy of this for any revisions that you make. And that way you've got a sort of audit trail, if you like. So let's have a look at the stuff that gets put in here. Let's just have a look at the information tab that I was just talking about. This is the top part of the information tab, which is the first tab that you'll see in the workbook. And you can see this information that I've been describing here, the date of submission and the submission number. And then across here, you can see the particular version of the Excel template that's been used and any notes relating to the latest changes. Underneath this information, you'll see the table that you can see here, which hopefully you'll have checked before submitting the workbook, but this summarizes issues or potential issues with the data in the workbook. And you can see that these are classified as validation checks, first stage credibility checks, and comparison table highlighting. Now, I'm going to come on to the second and third of these credibility checks and comparison table rows later, because they indicate places where we're likely to ask data verification questions. But before we leave the discussion about submitting the workbook, we need to focus on the first of these, the validation checks. So let's see. So here's an example. Validation errors occur where the data entered is just not feasible. So for example, you might have a negative number entered into a cell that cannot be negative. And there's an example here that you can see, and you can see it's well highlighted. We've got the number itself in red in the workbook cell. There's a message above the column where this has occurred, and either below or to the side of the table in question, you'll see a list of potential checks. And as you can see in this case, there's information there which will allow you to identify exactly what the problem is. Now, shouldn't perhaps be attempting to upload a workbook which has got validation errors, but if you do, what you will find in the workbook in the results package is that you will get an extra sheet called the validation sheet, and this will detail the specific validation errors. And these, of course, must be resolved before your workbook will be accepted as a valid submission. So I think that's probably all I want to say for the moment about submitting the workbook. So at this point, we'll pause for questions. And remember, as I said earlier, you can submit your questions by using the Q&A function of Zoom, and we reserve the chat function for other queries. But I can see that Claudia is ready to check in with us on questions. So Claudia, over to you. Have we got any questions?
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. We've had 2 questions so far, 2 very good ones. So we've had a couple more. So one is asking, do you have to use the results package version for future revisions? So this is quite a good question, actually, and Roger touched on this. So the results package version that you are downloading from the portal, let's say during data verification, you need to make some changes to your HESES workbook that we've identified through the data verification process. It's definitely in your best interest probably to use this version, because this, like Roger said, this is going to be the same version that we as data verifiers are going to be working off. And it's gone through the portal checking process. So it's probably recommended, although it's not necessarily a requirement. Would you agree with that, Roger?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that occasionally, although these workbooks are heavily tested, occasionally little glitches do slip through, and so if only for that reason, it's a good idea to have the latest version as well. And you know, we will always, whatever you download from the portal in terms of the workbook will be the latest version. So if only for that reason, I think it's a good idea. But yeah, we will go by, in terms of data verification, we will use the latest submission plugged in, as it were, to the latest template. So yeah, that's, I think, what we'd like.
Definitely, thank you. Okay, we've had another question. Has the portal key been sent? So this is normally to help, portal keys are going to be sent out to help get your portal user administrator set up. So if you haven't received your portal key, the best place to contact would be, as Roger said, that portal at officeforstudents.org.uk. But the first thing that you would want to do is, if you are not a user administrator for the portal at your institution, then you do want to talk to that person. But yeah, if you're still having issues with portal key, then definitely email the portal team. It's portal@officeforstudents.org.uk.
Yeah.
Another
Can I just
question.
add a little bit to that,
Go ahead.
Claudia? Yeah, sorry. As a user of the portal, in terms of accessing the area where HESES is, you shouldn't need an access key. As Claudia has said, there is the user administrators who may or may not have to deal with access keys. So if you're just using this in terms of wanting access to the particular area where HESES is, you shouldn't need an access key. As Claudia says, it's the user administrator who will assign access to the appropriate area to you. If they need, in terms of setting up a user administrator, there may be an access key involved. And as Claudia says, portal@officefostudents.org.uk is a place for user administrators to correspond with to straighten that out. So just to dot I's and cross T's on that one.
Okay. And we've had one more question. It says, do the validation errors need to be resolved prior to the 12th deadline? So that is definitely a yes. So validation error, like Roger said, it's an issue of feasibility. Whatever data you've entered in your workbook is just not feasible. So like the example that Roger gave, you've entered a negative number of students in your column 1. That's going to throw up a validation error because you can't have negative students in that sense. So if you try to upload a workbook to the portal that has validation errors, it's going to be rejected. It's going to throw up an error. So you will need to resolve those before the deadline, which so it's 12th of November is for further education, sixth form colleges and academies. So I'm assuming that applies to you if you're mentioning the 12th, and then the 10th of December is for all other providers. Got that one.
Yeah.
Okay. There's another, okay, I'll answer one more question here and then I'll hand back to you, Roger. This is quite a good one. So it's saying, if several changes are made, is a results package generated each time? And should we each time pick up the next version per the results package to make new changes? So the answer to this is yes. So every time you submit a workbook to the portal, we process it, and then you will get a results package that goes with that submission. And part of the reason for that is you're also going to get your date and your submission number. So like Roger said, it kind of gives you that nice record of when you submitted it, what number submission it was. And that's going to come really important during data verification when we say, okay, we're looking at version 6 that you submitted on this date, and that's the one that we're asking our questions about. And then that question, you know, each time should we pick up the new version of the results package to make any further changes? Again, we would definitely recommend this because that way you're using whatever is the most latest version, because that's what we're going to be using during data verification and asking our questions about in that way. There's a couple others. I might just leave those for now and hand back over to you, Roger.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Claudia. And yeah, and just to amplify what Claudia was saying there about workbooks on the portal, as we will see in one of the slides I'm coming to a little bit later on, the results package only, I won't go into all of the details here, but when you, if you have to resubmit your workbook after the submission deadline, the procedure is just slightly different in terms of the way it goes through the portal, and that's documented in the video and the other documentation in the appendix. I don't want to cloud the waters too much by talking about it here, but as we will be discussing in a moment, when data verification kicks in, there will be a data verifier for each provider, and they will be your first point of call for clarification on these types of questions. So don't hesitate to get in touch with them if you're not sure. Okay, so having looked at how to submit your workbook, in a moment we'll look at, let me move on to the next slide, I should say. There we go. In a moment we'll look at what happens when we do go into data verification. But before we do this, let's just take a step back at this point and consider the purpose of data verification and its place in the larger scheme of things. So let's just make sure the slides are moving here. Here we go. Yes, okay, good. So naturally, we expect providers to follow best practice when compiling and submitting data, because this data is used to determine funding as well as for other planning purposes. And for these reasons, it's also incumbent on us to use a robust data assurance process. So data verification is the first step really that we take to ensure that the data supplied to us is fit for purpose. And there may be further down the line, it may be that audits or data reconciliations are needed at a later date, but we'll not talk about those today. We're focusing on the data verification process. And with that in mind, it's important to say that where a provider fails to submit data on time or returns data that is not credible after verification, we may allocate funds based on our own estimates of student activity. We reserve the right to use our own estimates of data where we have reason to believe that provided data is not fit for purpose, and we reserve the right to review funding allocations for the most recent 7-year period. So that all having been said, let's ask when it comes to HESES, let's talk about what we're looking for. And what we're really trying to do here is to get the best possible representation of your higher education provision to enable us to make accurate grant allocations. So data verification allows us to be confident in the accuracy of your data, to be confident in the robustness of the processes, your data processes, to identify any large or unexpected changes compared to previous years, and really to understand the context of your data, how HESES relates to what's happening with your provision, as it says here. Now, notice that it's common for us to ask queries to practically all providers. So I know that occasionally when particularly if people are new to this process, when the queries arrive, please don't feel we're picking on you. Everybody gets asked this kind of stuff. It's the first step in our due diligence process, and as mentioned, there may be other steps further down the line, but that's something that we're not going to focus on here. But it benefits all of us for the reasons on the screen, and hopefully, as we found occasionally, that providers will say to us that just the exercise of looking at this in terms of their activity, looking at their data in this way, does give them the chance to focus on how their provision is changing. So, what are our data validation queries based on? Well, these are the areas from which the data verification queries are generated. The first stage credibility warnings on the workbook tables that we've already mentioned. This is where data is possible, but is perhaps slightly unusual. Comparison table highlighting. We've mentioned the comparison tables a little earlier, but we haven't really said much more about them yet, and they're not something you enter data into. They're automatically filled in, but we'll talk about those a little bit more in a moment or two. But for now, we'll just say that this is where we find out about greater than expected changes in data in the workbook compared to previous years and other sources. And as noted before, you see these referenced on the information sheet. And there may be other relevant issues as well. These are things which perhaps are not necessarily highlighted in the workbook, but might be things which just come to our attention anyway, or that we know are sort of on the radar. And mergers are mentioned here, and that's a good example. So, and there may be other things which come to light in the data verification process. And as I say, it's important to realize that, because you see all this yellow and orange and red, well, the red, hopefully we're aiming for what we see here under the validation check with this green text, no validation errors. But just because of these other queries, it doesn't necessarily mean that we think your data is wrong. It's just that it's perhaps not what we might have expected. And the larger the difference or the change, the more we'll sort of dig into it and look for detailed explanations. So just to give you an idea of what we're discussing here, let's look a little bit more closely at credibility warnings and comparison table highlighting. Comparison table highlighting, these two here, and just look a little bit closer at those so we can get an idea of what's going on here. So for first stage credibility warnings, I've got a little example here. And as we say, data is possible, but is unusual. So this might be, for example, a kind of thing where if we look at table 5, there's a section B of table 5 where we ask you to record new entrants. It might be, for example, that if there's a workbook where all students are recorded as new entrants on table 5, well, that might be accurate for a new provider, but for others, more established providers, not perhaps what we'd expect to see. So you see that the errors are shown above the column like this, and also in the same sort of fashion that we saw earlier, underneath or to the side of the table. And you can see here it's highlighted, so you can identify exactly where the problem is. Workbooks with credibility warnings like this will be accepted, but as valid submissions, but this will almost certainly trigger a query during the data verification process. So that's something that you might want to investigate the underlying cause for. And if at all possible, we like you to submit what we call initial explanations, because that can speed up the verification process quite a lot. And exactly what they are and how to do that, I will come to in just a moment or so. But first, we're going to look at comparison table highlighting. And this is the counterpart to first stage credibility warnings. And as I said a moment ago, comparison tables, these appear towards the end of the HESES workbook, and their contents, as you can see here, are automatically generated from workbook data and from other sources, primarily from things like the Individualized Learner Record and the HESES, the Higher Education Statistics Agency student records of different types. Now, because there are several of these and several variants, I'm not going to show you specific examples, but you'll probably notice these as you're looking at your workbook. And really, here's just an illustration of the kind of thing that you might see. The point to remember here is that this type of highlighting occurs if comparisons made in this table extend beyond predefined thresholds. Now, if you want to look at these, all of the parameters and the thresholds are laid out in some detail in a couple of appendices to the completing the HESES workbook document. I've already talked about the first one about using the portal, but there are a couple of others which lay out all of these parameters and all of the thresholds. So you can see how that is arrived at, the highlighting is arrived at. And again, it doesn't necessarily signal that we think there's anything wrong or that the data is incorrect. It's just that this is perhaps not what we might have expected in the light of the data that we've got so far. So again, you will find that it's quite okay to submit these workbooks. But again, the highlighted fields are likely to be queried, so you might want to investigate the causes. And again, if you can, submitting initial explanations will be helpful for everybody. So I've mentioned initial explanations a couple of times now, so let's talk about them in a little bit more detail. Effectively, these are preemptive responses to data verifications that you can send to us once you've sent us your final submission. So as a quick example, suppose that a provider has a new extra intake in January, and that, for example, would, using table 5 section B as an example again, would mean you have inflated numbers in that section there, section B. So you might find that you get a credibility warning there, and that might also trigger various comparison table highlights as well. So this is the kind of thing where it's not mandatory, but if you can identify what's going on here in initial explanations, that could speed up the data verification process. And again, you know, this is something which providers say to us, thinking about formulating initial explanations allows them to think about the changing nature of their provision, so it can be useful to all sorts of people. There's no prescribed format for these. We ask you to send them to dataverification@officestudents.org.uk. As I say, no prescribed format, but please refer to whichever it is, the first stage credibility checks or the comparison table highlighting involved. And if there's anything else which you think is relevant or might be of interest to us, then do please include that information as well. So we like initial explanations. So let's turn our attention now to what happens after the submission deadline. In other words, the start of data verification. As I said a few moments ago, after that passes, we begin, and it's an iterative process. You'll be assigned to a data verification specialist who will be your main point of contact throughout all of this. There will probably be multiple rounds of queries, and so the data verification specialist you're assigned to will usually have a partner as well, a sort of buddy, again, in the same way that we like to have multiple points of contact at each provider. That allows others, allows you to get in touch with us if there are holidays or illness or whatever. And we get everybody covered by doing that. What happens is, after the submission deadline, we will email the student data contact at each provider, and usually do that within 5 working days of the deadline passing. And on that email, attached to that will be a letter with full instructions on the process, a data verification query document, the DVQ, listing the various specific queries, and we'll look at one of those in a moment, and a deadline for receiving your responses, which again is usually 5 working days away, certainly initially. And I'll show you an example of the template shortly. We'll look at how to respond to the queries later on. So let's move on to the actual mechanics of this. The template itself is actually a Microsoft Word document. It contains both the queries and the provider's responses, and we simply exchange it by email between the data verifier and the student's data contact. Again, there's just a point here about having more than one student data contact, so that in the case of unexpected absence or holidays, we don't have single points of dependence. If you want to nominate a colleague as a student data contact, then please write to HESES@officeforstudents.org.uk, and we can look into setting that up for you. Probably a good idea to get them set up on the portal as well, as we discussed earlier, and also to make sure that workbooks and correspondence are in places where your colleagues can find it if they need to. So now I want to just look at an example of a data verification query template. And I've mentioned already the videos that we've done, and this is basically a copy of what I have walked through in the video. So I'll just go through it fairly quickly here. The idea of this is just to give you a feel for the sort of backwards and forwards of the exchanges which may happen in the data verification process. And I'll walk you through this. So what we've got here is an extract from a template here, which is for the comparison table queries, which we've got. There's a similar section for first stage credibility warnings, which looks pretty much the same as this. And as I say, these are just exchange between people in the process. And you can see here, this example shows a query based on the highlighting of some cells in table H, the proportion of new entrants. And we won't show the actual table itself here because that's not really the point. We're just trying to show you how the mechanism works and format, and concentrate on the format of the DVQs. In the column headed table row, you can see the relevant place on the comparison table which is being referred to, and in this case it's to do with the part that details full-time and sandwich year out undergraduate, home and EU students. And in the next column headed query, you can see in that first paragraph there the reason for this is because the threshold of the percentage change has been triggered. Underneath, you can see the data verifier specialist has actually written the request for further information. And notice that all of the various queries here are dated. And to help us, we'd like you to date your responses as well. And further to this, you can also see that a lot of data verifiers will do is they will color code their questions. If it looks like it's going beyond 1 or 2 exchanges, this helps everybody keep track of what's going on. So we ask you, if you can, to also do the same to help tie everything together. And then once you get to the point like this one where everything's been tied off and everything makes sense, you'll find that next time it comes back, that row in the document will be grayed out like this to show that there are no further queries on that particular topic. So let's think about what the most common queries are. There are probably two categories here, and we'll find that changes in the proportion of students by price group, mode of study, and fundability status are one of the top two, and the other one is probably changes in non-completion rates. Now, what we often find is that there are potentially one underlying issue or event can relate to several different queries on the workbook in the comparison tables, particularly. And if you want to cross-reference your responses, then please feel free to do that. And in fact, the data verifier will very often suspect this anyway and may sort of make the link themselves in terms of what they send you. So in terms of generating your responses as well, let's think about that. We're looking for responses that directly relate to the query raised and do so at an appropriate level of detail with an understanding of the HESES definitions. So what we sometimes find, particularly with people who are new to this, is that they say it's difficult to get into generating a response. And what we usually say is, well, ask yourself the question, how has your provision changed? And that's often a good way of finding a way into generating a response. As we've just said, very often you may find that queries are related. And so, you may, for example, find that you're giving an explanation in response to one query and it directly relates to something else, so you can just cross-reference. It's perhaps worth looking at responses from previous years. They may still apply or perhaps may be modified, but it's something worth thinking about in referencing what's gone before. And as I said earlier, if you can date your responses and color code in the same way that your data verifier has, then that helps keep everything tied up and collected nicely together. So having written your responses, you need to send them back to us. And this is a point where it's probably a good idea to just check that you have actually got all of the queries. Often, as I say, you'll find that you might find that your workbook data needs to be changed in the light of what you've discussed with your data verifier in analyzing the queries. And if that's the case, get in touch with them and they will assist you in going through that process. Otherwise, you can email your responses to dataverification@officeforstudents.org.uk. Please do this within the deadline that was set when the DVQs were sent to you. And initially, as we said earlier, this is going to be 5 working days. Several rounds of queries may be needed. Sometimes it's easier than in other cases. So what we may find is as the sign-off deadline approaches, tighter deadlines might apply, but we will take into account the proximity of the holidays as we get closer towards the end of the year. So we just mentioned the possibility of having to amend your workbook before or as part of the data verification process. So let's talk a little bit about that. It's something which comes up occasionally. We realize that there's perhaps something which hasn't been classified correctly and it means that the workbook needs to be amended. Liaise with your data verifier, as I said a moment ago. After the submission deadline, the upload process works just very slightly differently. I touched on this a little bit earlier and I won't go into too much detail here. Please refer to the video and to the documentation that I cited earlier. And as I say, your data verifier will help you with this. So once again, that's quite a big chunk dealing with data verification, but I think we're now once again at the point where we can ask Claudia to tell us if there are any new questions. So Claudia, over to you.
Thank you. We have had a couple questions come in. So one of them is asking just how long is the HESES data verification process? So it does span a few months. So data verification really starts whenever your workbook is due. So that could be 12th of November or 10th of December, depending on what type of provider you have. And it goes right up through the deadline, which is 2nd of February. It's data verification for you as an individual provider is really going to depend on how many rounds of queries and amendments need to be made, but it does take place over that multi-month long process. We had a question in terms of using HESES data to compare with HESES submissions. So I think this is the comparison tables. Do you use the latest HESES submission, or do you use several years of HESES data? So if available for your provider, then we will use several years of HESES data. I think, is it 2 years, Roger? Can you remember? We go back.
It can be up to, I think, normally a couple of years. I think I may remember in years gone by that we might have used 3 on one occasion. I'd need to check that, but certainly we'd look at the latest figures that we could get, and possibly also the year before. It kind of depends on the comparison table and what's being compared against what. So yeah, at least 1 year, probably 2.
Yeah.
I can't remember for sure if we go further back, but it depends.
Yeah, it's definitely at least 2 years. Apologies that neither of us can remember this off the top of our heads. Mostly 2, yeah, sometimes 3, thank you, Will. So yeah, if we do have that data for you as a provider, then we will use it, because that is going to help inform, kind of see trends over time as we're looking at your HESES data. And you know, like Roger said, if there's been a change in your provision, then that will come out through that, the length of data history that we have. We've had 2 fairly similar questions, so I'm going to bunch these together. Bearing in mind the effects of COVID-19 on HESES19 and our student data, how is this going to impact HESES20? So we touched on this a little in the introduction to HESES and changes from HESES19 presentation. Obviously, this could very well impact your data and therefore your data verification this year. We did put out a letter on 6th of May where we talked about the impact and the implications of the coronavirus pandemic on OFS funding, and we do touch on the impact on HESES. And you know, people who are working data verification, we are going to keep this in mind as we look at your data. There's a couple areas where there seem to be a lot of questions around this, mainly around completions versus non-completions. So as we touched on earlier, you know, when you're calculating your non-completions, we want you to use historical data, and we want you to use data that is not impacted. The estimates that you're using should not be skewed by any exceptional circumstances. So in previous years, those exceptional circumstances might have been strike action at a provider, but obviously this year we're thinking about exceptional circumstances being the coronavirus pandemic. So that kind of data shouldn't be used in calculating your non-completions. So we wouldn't expect to see those changes in your HESES as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we certainly are going to bear this in mind as we do data verification. You know, and if you do want to include this in your initial explanations that you submit, like Roger said, you know, if there has been a very large change in your provision, then it would certainly be helpful to get that in those initial explanations that you do send us. I can put a link in the chat to the letter that we sent out that might help also answer a couple of those questions. So I will do that in just a minute. Couple more questions. So does the comparison to HESES data include the aggregate offshore return? This came up the other day. I am not sure about this one. I don't know about you, Roger. We may have to get back to you on this one, Greg.
Yes, I'm afraid that's not something I come across day to day. So I think we will have to come back to you on that one. That sounds like something very definitely in the HESES realm, and we live primarily in the HESES realm, and I know obviously the two overlap, but that's not something that's not in my Venn diagram, I think, as somebody once said. So you'll forgive us, we will look into that, and we've got the name, Claudia, so if we can't answer it live, then we will certainly follow up with you.
Oh, I see Ross has come in and said a definitive no. So thank you for that, Ross.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah, Ross is lurking in the background.
Thank you. And then just one more question here. Will we be given a final confirmation that OFS queries are complete and the process has ended except for the sign off? Yes, most definitely. So you will get from your data verifier, whoever that person is, they will let you know and say, thank you for your responses. We have no more queries at this point. And they will actually then tell you to initiate the sign off process. So you will know when it's done. And when we are then ready for you to sign off and submit that sign off to the portal. So I think that's all the questions for now. So I will hand back over to you, Roger.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. And in fact, that last question leads us nicely into the final section of the presentation here, which is about getting the sign off. I'll just correct you on one thing. The portal isn't actually involved in the sign off at all. That's something which is done by email. But yeah, Claudia's quite right in all of the other stuff that she said about the sign off. And we'll go through this briefly now. And if there are still any questions about sign off, then by all means, let us have them. I should point out that at the end of this section, we'll throw over to Claudia again for questions and answers, and that will be the last chance you'll have to ask questions live. But as we started in recent sessions, we're going to keep the Q&A open for 4 or 5 minutes after this session, so that if there's anything else which comes in last minute, we'll see if we can respond to that. But at any time after that, if you want to get back in touch with us, use the email address heses@officestudents.org.uk, which I'll show you again on a separate slide at the end, and you can write to us, and I know 1 or 2 people have already done that. So as I said at the beginning, getting the sign off of your data is really what we've been aiming for throughout this whole process, and it's worth re-emphasizing the importance of this because it represents the data that we will be using in calculating, not only just in grant allocations, but also in other planning things, but in particular in calculating the grant allocations for the next academic year, which will be published in the springtime. So let's think about this then, and we can say that sign-off form is going to be sent to you once all our queries have been resolved and any amendments processed, as Claudia was just saying. And it shows the submission date and number of the workbook, which represents the data which you're signing off. And therefore, of course, it's important, therefore, to check that this ties up and make sure that you're signing off on essentially the most recent thing that's been submitted. It must be signed and returned to us by the sign-off deadline, which, as Claudia said, is the 2nd of February 2021. Seems like it's ages away, but it will be with us all before too long. And the sign-off must be by the providers, each provider's accountable officer. And occasionally there are difficulties in making sure that they're available. So if it's anticipated in any way that they're not going to be available, then do please let us know as soon as you can. And we will need to look into ways of getting around that. It's worth saying here that we expect the data is signed off to be the final data which we use in all of our work going forward. Data signed off by the accountable officer, but you know, things being as they are, sometimes errors are identified in the data after it's been signed off, or even after we've used it in some way. Now, it can be amended, but we will only accept amendments to final submitted data in exceptional circumstances, and there are certain conditions regarding this. To be accepted, errors must be widespread and significant, and they must relate to clear evidence of data error rather than just reinterpretation of the data, and they must be likely to have a material impact on one or more of our uses of the data. So the way that this works is that a data amendment panel sits regular intervals throughout the year, and will assess errors using information provided to them, and then they decide or recommend on whether we require the errors to be corrected. So if you believe that your data may need to be amended after sign off, then please contact us straight away, and you can get further details on this on our website, www.officestudents.org.uk/data and analysis/amendments to data. And again, for those that rely on the audio only, data and analysis is hyphenated, as is amendments to data. So let's just start to bring things together here by looking at some, or collating some of the things that we've already been talking about, and introducing one or two other things here in terms of things to remember when you're doing the going through the data verification process. It's a good idea to have another member of staff review the workbook before you submit it. If you look at the completing the HESES20 workbook document available in the usual place, there's a self-check questionnaire in there, and very strongly recommend that you go through that and make sure that you can answer yes to all of the questions in that. As we've already been discussing, look for any automatic highlighting that the workbook has thrown up and investigate the reasons for that, because they're more than likely going to be queried in the data verification process. And as we've said already, although it's not mandatory, initial explanations can really speed things up. And again, without wishing to sound like a broken record, alternative contacts are a good thing for us as well, because that can help speed things up, particularly as we approach the holiday period, if it goes on that long, or for any other unexpected absences. So I think we're getting towards the point now where we can look back and say, look at what we've covered today. So we looked in the first part of this presentation at how to submit your HESES20 workbook, and we concentrated a little bit there on the portal. And then we had a deep dive into the data verification process of your HESES return itself. What we've just been looking at here is the submission and submission of the sign-off, of getting the sign-off done, which, as I said, is probably the biggest thing that we're all after here at the end of the day. So I'll remind you that the recording of this event is probably going to be available in 48 hours time, thereabouts, probably Friday. And at this point, I think we need to throw back to Claudia again, just to see if there are any last minute questions. As I say, after we wrap, we will keep the Q&A open for 4 or 5 minutes, but how do we stand at the moment, Claudia?
We actually do not have any open questions right now, so I will take that as a good sign that you've covered everything. I do have one piece of good news though. We've just received confirmation that the guidance publication will be going live on Friday, so please look for that on our website then. So it should be very timely. The publication will go out, as well as hopefully the recording of this session. We just had one question. How do you send initial explanations? Very good question. As Roger said, we do like to receive those. You can send those to us at HESES@officeforstudents.org.uk, and we will take those in and file them away. And then once you are assigned to a data verification specialist, then they will go ahead and look through those additional explanations and use that for any queries. Oh, or you can send it to dataverification@officeforstudents.org.uk. They're all shared email inboxes, so they will definitely be seen, I promise you.
Yeah. We prefer data verification for initial explanations, but it doesn't matter. It all reaches either way. Yeah.
We've had one question. Will you email when the rule book uploaded? I'm assuming this means the guidance publication. We won't be sending out an email. It may go out in the OFS alerts email that goes out on a weekly basis, but as well, if you just go onto our website, officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, it'll be uploaded there, as well as on our publications pages as well. Thank you. And then there's one question that's come in. Are we able to ask questions related to previous sessions? Yeah, that's fine. So Roger said we'll be available for next few minutes. So if you want to send us a question, then we can type an answer to you that way. And I think that might be it. So back to you, Roger.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. And just to, I'm not certain about this because I don't quite have Claudia's contact information, which she's kept her ears to the ground while I've been speaking. I know that one of the things that was going to be timed to coincide with the publication of the guidance document and the completing the HESES20 workbook document was the release of the videos. So you should find a link goes active at the same time. And it will become visible on our YouTube channel. So there are more than a dozen, baker's dozen, 13 videos, which covers a lot of the same territory that we've done over the last few sessions on the webinar, but in some cases we go a little bit deeper, and some of you may find that, so you may want to watch them all, although you can pick and choose. And I'd certainly recommend it for the stuff about the portal. Where we've got one or two live sessions, including the portal, and there's a bit that I've done for filling out the courses table, and also for just filling in the normal workbook tables. Good. Okay, so let's think about what comes next. As I said earlier, this represents the last of the, if you like, the pure content webinars, but next week we have the first of our practical workbook sessions, hands-on workbook sessions in breakout groups. And you can see here the topics that we're going to be looking at: what the HESES workbook is, how it works, how the HESES definitions apply to the workbook, how to determine student and course characteristics from given data, how to categorize student data and input it into the workbook accurately. And as you can see here, the first one is on Monday next week, the 12th of October at 1:30. And I'm sure that we'll see many of you there. I'm afraid that that one and the second session on the 14th are both full. So we have added some more sessions the following week, Tuesday the 20th and Thursday the 22nd. Now these all start at 1:30. As did this one. You only need to attend one of these. The exercises that we do in each one is going to be the same in each case, so you only need to come to one of them. And because of the demand for these, we're limiting places to one attendee per provider. And also because space is limited, we really do want these to be for people who perhaps are coming to HESES for the first time and are not sure about it. So if you've got colleagues, or if you yourself feel that you're an old hand at HESES, this may not be for you, but you can check it all out at officeforstudents.org.uk/events for details and to find out how to sign up. And this is also the point where we just, oops, sorry, skipped a slide. This is the point at which we give you all of the information which you've already seen several times. Just a reminder of our website address, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, the email, HESES@officeforstudents.org.uk, the YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/officeforstudents, where in a couple of days you should find the videos. But if you've got any questions at any time, just drop us a line. And as I said earlier, we will be keeping the Q&A open for 4 or 5 minutes from here, but I think that brings us to the end of the session today. So thank you very much for attending. We hope to see some of you at the practical sessions in the next week or two. And with that, I'll say thank you, take care, and goodbye.